AI knows about me, but obviously it didn't know the most important part about myself, because that is how a physicist creates his own family. There's a structure behind it, you know. My name is Alexander, my wife's name is Bettina, our daughter's name is Caroline. She just passed her driving license test this morning, so we are very glad. And my son is David. And then our friends told us, did you know that the alphabet has actually 26 letters? But God didn't allow us to go that far. But we are happy with the two children as well. Okay. Yeah. Today it will be about, can a scientist believe in God, or Vjera i nauka, or yeah. And I hope that I can give you some glimpse into this very complex issue, some inroads that you can also use in your private conversations or in your studies. This will not be all-encompassing, because that would be a lecture series of 20 talks or something if you would cover everything to exhaustion, and many people have said things, but I hope it helps you a bit in your practical discourses. This is our institute in Germany, if you can speak German. Most of the resources are in German. Like, this is Institut für Glaube und Wissenschaft, iguw.de. This is our website. We also have a second website, begründetglauben.org. This is like reasons for faith, something like that, yeah, justified faith. And there's also a podcast in German with more than 300 episodes by now. Yeah, and we are also on the social media. We have published books and also movies. And the movies are also available in English, and you can actually find them in our Vimeo channel. There is a channel that we have on the Vimeo platform. Do you know that? Vimeo? How do you pronounce it? I don't know. Vimeo, okay, yeah. And they're also in English, like Our Fascinating Universe. It's about the fine-tuning of the universe, Big Bang Theory, and so on. Then one about neuroscience, More Than My Brain. And the most recent one, it's about suffering. Is there meaning in suffering? Covering the question on an existential level with people who are suffering or have suffered from illness or genocide, but also from a theological and philosophical point. We have an atheist philosopher, we have a Muslim philosopher, we have a Jewish rabbi, we have a former Buddhist monk, and of course also Christian people giving their perspective on suffering. And Tom Holland is on it as well. Not the Spider-Man, by the way, but the best-selling author. Have a look at it on Vimeo. But now back to Nauka, to science. What does a scientist do? When I was a child, I grew up in a very little city in the north of Bavaria, Hof, which no one knows usually. But there was a little star observatory there, and you could watch the stars. And from time to time, I enjoyed to go there, even though I hardly had a chance to really watch the stars through the devices there. But they also had interesting lectures with scientists and theologians talking about science and faith. So this is the sky as you see it when you watch through a telescope. If I, as a theoretical physicist, had created the stars and the sky, I would have created it that way. Because this way I have a much clearer view and perspective what's in the sky, how many big stars, how many small stars, which categories, and how many. But I admit this might look a bit more fascinating and interesting and beautiful. So the talk is given in several short chapters. So I have 9 chapters. Maybe we skip 1 or 2 chapters. We will see how far we get. And if you fall asleep during one of the chapters, which sometimes can happen if a theoretical physicist talks, then you can just sleep for 1 chapter and listen again for the next chapter when you are awake again. So I hope to wake you up again. And there will be someone who will help us waking up again. I will tell you later. You will get to know that person. So what's the starting point? Well, the starting point is science is very successful. We all know that. We have this TV here. Then we have antibiotics, for example. Otherwise, a lot of us might not be here because our grandparents would have died already for some serious illnesses and so on. So yes, science is successful, and it claims to explain everything on natural grounds only. We don't need any goddess like Zeus to explain the thunder. We have the theories of hydrodynamics and thermodynamics and electrodynamics, and thereby we can fully explain why there is thunder and lightning. Or let's say lightning and then thunder, actually, because the order is important. And okay, science is successful. So the question is nature a closed, self-contained system, as we don't need Zeus anymore? We don't need any gods anymore to explain most of the processes, so is nature a closed system? And nothing exists beyond nature. Isn't that a logical conclusion from eliminating Zeus and all the gods from nature? Well, it is thinkable, it could be, but let us for a moment face the consequences, if that was true. I'm probably too fast for the translation, am I? No? Okay. So I want to quote Nobel Prize winner Jacques Monod, who actually claimed that nature is a closed system. And he wrote a book about it, and he called it Chance and Necessity. Everything, also we ourselves, are the product of chance and necessity. Nature is a closed system. And he says, if mankind accepts this message in its full significance, man must at last wake out of his millenniary dream and discover his total solitude, his fundamental isolation. He must realize that, like a homeless person, like a gypsy, he lives on the boundary of an alien world. A world that is deaf to his music and as indifferent to his hopes as it is to his suffering or his crimes. What he says is that if there is only matter and nothing else, then we are lost in this space, in this vast space of the universe, and we have no reason to assume that there is any kind of justice. No, a criminal who is good enough and fast enough and clever enough to escape the police will never experience the just punishment for his deeds. And that is also true for dictators and other people who do bad things. Also in our suffering, we have no comfort, because when the universe is all that there is, then where should comfort come from? The only thing that we can know for sure is that in about 2 billion years, planet Earth will be gone. And if any kind of alien spaceships come along that way, they might stop here and say, you know, there is a legend, a very old legend, an ancient legend, that there has been a highly developed civilization in this solar system, but actually you can't find any traces anymore. So a lot of people doubt that this kind of civilization has ever existed. And actually, on the long run, in 8 billion years, there will be no galaxies anymore. It will all be diluted in a vast space. The universe will expand forever. So no hope, no comfort, no justice for crimes and for the victims. That's the message of a material universe. In short, you are lost. We come from nothing, we go to nothing, as Monty Python famously said. So what do we have to lose? Nothing. Hence, if we take this perspective, isn't it worth to at least take some time to think about possible alternatives? Couldn't it be that there is a better message than this one? You can't lose anything anyway. So, first question. I have structured this whole lecture in questions. It's always questions. First questions, why do scientists themselves have different worldviews on this topic, whether there is a God or whether nature is a closed system and there is no God? For example, Francis Crick, Nobel Prize winner, co-discoverer of the DNA structure, he said, the simple fables of the religious of the world have come to seem like tales told to children. Don't believe anyone who tells you about gods or holy books. This is all a fairy tale told to children. The universe is all that there is. This is Nobel Prize winner Francis Crick, co-discoverer of the DNA. Another scientist who is very famous for working with the DNA is Francis Collins. He was the director of the Human Genome Project, and in June 2000, he was privileged to publish the sequence of the whole human genome. more than 3 billion letters that were discovered, that were decoded at that point. Not yet decoded and understood, but we had the series of the letters. That's important to know. It's like a book that we can't read yet, or only a few passages that we can actually read. And what does he say about nature and God? He says, "It is humbling for me and awe-inspiring to realize that we have caught the first glimpse of our own instruction book previously known only to God." And he wrote a book, The Language of God, A Scientist Presents Evidence for Belief. Isn't that interesting? Two Francises, two geneticists, very famous geneticists, very successful, very clever. And one says, it's very clear that there is no God, and this fits very well with my research that I do in my science lab. And another one says, well, it fits very well with my belief in God. Completely opposite opinions. And when we travel back in history, then we will find that there are quite a few other scientists who also did not see a problem doing science and believing in a creator God. Like the list of these people here, I don't read all of them out, but you will probably have heard of several of them in your physics classes or chemistry classes and so on. All of them believe that there is a personal God. Many of them even believed in the Jewish Christian God, or were Christians. So why is it that these people had no problem believing in a personal God or in the Christian God? Well, the reason is that it's not a conflict between science and faith in God, but it's a conflict between two different worldviews. One worldview is materialism or atheism. There is no God. There is only the material world. And the other worldview is theism, the belief that there is a God, theos in Greek, God, and they are opposed to each other. In theism, you believe that mind is primary, God is mind. He's not material, he's mind. God exists forever, and he creates by whichever means. People disagree on the methods, but at least they agree God is the creator. And he created, by some methods, matter. Materialists believe the opposite. They believe matter is primary and eternal, and mind, also a godly being that has mind, would only emerge of a long time process through emergent evolutionary processes. And Richard Dawkins even says, as our own existence is already very improbable, the existence of God is even less probable. And so he's quite sure that God cannot exist. But this way, he defines God as a created being, interestingly, not as the eternal God that we believe in the monotheistic religions, in Jewish faith, in Christian faith, and in Muslim faith. And so now, when they stand in the lab, maybe Francis Collins and Francis Crick could challenge Francis Collins and say, you know what, you are a believer and you're a scientist. Please prove to me via a scientific experiment that there is a God. And then Francis Collins might say, okay, so what experiment do you imagine? What should I actually measure in order to prove the existence of God to you? What should we measure? That's not very easy. But let me ask you a different question. Let me ask you, using the methods of physics and chemistry, please prove to me that this very beautiful picture, the Star Night of Van Gogh, actually was painted by Van Gogh. And then the physicist can measure the weight, the dimensions, the volume. The chemist can tell you which chemical elements are in these colors, and so on. But no one can really prove you that Van Gogh has painted this picture. And why is it? Because Van Gogh is not a part of this picture. He is the painter, and hence he is transcendent. He's beyond the picture, as philosophers would say. And the same is true for God and nature. If God is the creator of the universe, how should he be himself measurable in the universe if he's the painter of the picture? We know about Van Gogh only because of historical evidence, it was transmitted to us that he painted that picture, and we trust the sources. That's how we know about it. But we have no scientific proof for that. Of course, when we know that there is Van Gogh and that there is this picture, we can compare other pictures of Van Gogh, and then we can find scientific evidence that this is a typical style how Van Gogh paints his pictures. So we can find some evidence and arguments that corroborate the thesis that Van Gogh painted that picture, but we cannot prove Van Gogh himself in the picture because he's more than the picture. And that's a very important point to scientists who claim, I will only believe in God if you measure him in our universe, if you prove God in the universe, which is not possible because God is more than the universe. He's transcendent. But he's also immanent, so he left traces and evidence in the picture. And so the big question is not, can you prove God to me? But given the evidence that we find in the picture of Van Gogh, or the evidence that we find in nature or in creation, nature means that which has developed, and creation means that which has been created, which has been made. So this already implies a worldview, interestingly. So we need to check the evidence, and then we need to ask the question, does the evidence fit better a materialistic worldview, that there is only the material universe, or does it fit better the Christian theistic worldview, or another theistic worldview, of course, that there is a creator God that is responsible for this universe? And this will be rather like in a court case. We have a judge, that's in this case it's you, and then we have the evidence, what we measure and what we observe in nature, and then we have the evidence, and one judge might say, I think the evidence very plausibly supports it was a murder, and the other judge might say, well, I think the evidence is not enough for murder, it's rather an accident. So different judges might still come to different conclusions. There is still some final freedom, no matter how conclusive and how plausible we evaluate the evidence. And still, I think we can get some clues. At least for me, I think it's much more plausible to believe in one of these two worldviews. So let's start with our spaceship and travel into the world of science. So if you have fallen asleep, now get on board again. Why are there laws in nature? And this is actually something very peculiar. We take it for self-evident when we do science. When I studied physics, there was no professor who ever asked the question, why are there laws in nature? It was always clear that there are laws and we can discover them and describe them in mathematical terms. That was a given. But if you ask the question, and actually it's not completely true, one professor, a theoretical physicist professor, he sometimes during his lecture said, well, this fascinating equation, the potential equation, it's so beautiful, and nature was really gracious with us that we could discover this equation and that this equation describes what we observe in nature. So yes, some people come to think, because matter itself could behave in any possible way. And mathematics would even be true if this material universe and our material bodies would not be here. Mathematics is actually a logical discipline, academic discipline. It's not a scientific discipline. It is used in science because it is so successful in describing material processes, but it is not part of science. Mathematics is true even without the material world. 1 + 1 is 2, no matter whether there are stones or no stones. You can also count spirits or whatever, but you don't need a material world. So also Albert Einstein discovered this and found that peculiar. He said the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible, and that it is a miracle. Meaning, he cannot think of any plausible explanation why the material world conforms to mathematical beauty, mathematical symmetry, mathematical equations, which is the key to actually govern nature and predict nature. If mathematics would not work, it would be much harder to predict the behavior of nature, to predict the weather tomorrow, and so on. And all our technological world lives on this predictive power of science. When we travel back in time again by 300 years to Kepler, for example, Kepler had to study the orbital data of Mars for more than 6 years. That's a very long time if you think about how long a PhD takes. Yeah, I don't wish to any one of you that you have to work 6 years to get your PhD. Hopefully you get it earlier. At least if you work full-time. If you work part-time for your PhD, it might take longer. But full-time, 6 years is really long. And so some people told him, give up. You won't find any law in nature, in these movements. It's just not there. And he says, yes, it is there. Because God is rational, hence he put rational laws into nature, into his creation. And so he studied and he found his 3 famous Kepler laws by which he could predict the distance of the planets from the sun by measuring the time, how long they need to orbit around the sun, like 1 year for Mars and so on. And with his 3rd law, you can calculate then the distance to the sun, actually, if you know the distance of Earth and sun, which can be found by geometrical means. So, it's interesting. The pioneers of science did not do some experiments with nature and then, whoops, how funny, there's a law. I didn't expect that. How come it about? No, they expected law. They were persuaded there must be law, and finally they found it. And that was the starting point of modern science. So the belief that there is rational law in nature, because there is a rational lawgiver who created nature, is fundamental to the rise and to the start of modern science, actually. Another friend of Einstein, Eugen Wigner, he wrote a whole paper about this, and there he says, the miracle of the appropriateness of the language of mathematics for the formulation of the laws of physics is a wonderful gift which we neither understand nor deserve. Even morally, he thinks, actually, the way how we treat nature and what we do with our knowledge, building weapons and so on, is probably, we should not have been given that gift. We are not worth it. And we don't understand why it is there. He's also an agnostic, like Einstein. He's not really a believer in any kind of deity. So this should make us think. This is the Lama of wisdom, and this will accompany us during our journey. And so this is the first time to stop and to think. I love lamas. Especially this facial expression. It really makes me think, what's going on here? What use would these laws be if we could not understand the laws? So there is a second premise that we need to do good science. And this is that our minds can actually discover truth. Geneticist J.B.S. Haldane said the following: it seems to me immensely unlikely that mind is a mere byproduct of matter. For if my mental processes, the thoughts in my mind, are determined wholly by the motions of atoms in my brain, the material processes, then, if that was true, then I have no reason to suppose that my beliefs are actually true, because they follow just chemical laws, electromagnetic laws. And these laws do not necessarily lead to truth. A calculator that calculates 1 + 1 is equal to 3 does not break any natural law. But, of course, it breaks the laws of logic and of mathematics. 1 + 1 is 2. But natural laws are not against them. They maybe sound chemically like the calculator calculating 1 + 1 is equal to 3, but that does not make them sound logically. 1 + 1 is 2. And hence, I have no reason for supposing my brain to be composed of atoms. Why? Because these are just thoughts of my mind. And my mind is just the byproduct of chemical potentials releasing a threshold signal at some point. Can we trust our minds? If that is true, then we are actually sawing off the branch on which we as scientists are sitting. We can only do science if we can trust our mind. But if the results of our science would actually suppose or suggest that our minds do not really work and cannot be trusted, how can we trust any theory of science? Also, Charles Darwin thought about that already. It's called Charles Darwin's doubt, horrid doubt, actually. With me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals according to his own theory of evolution, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Because thinking is just the byproduct of variation and selection for reproduction. Only those who can reproduce in the most powerful way, they will survive and pass on their genes. If you don't reproduce, your genes will be lost. And to be honest, it's a paradox because usually the most intelligent people, Nobel Prize winners, philosophers, theoretical physicists like Albert Einstein or so on, they were not always the most successful reproducers, actually. A lot of them had no children at all. Might have to do with their hair, maybe, I don't know. But it shows that reproductive success and intelligence do not really correlate, which is really a problem for the theory of biological evolution. If thinking is just the product of something else, why should we trust our logic to be true? Thinking must be free and reliable, not necessarily determined by some natural laws, something else that is going on, free and reliable to follow the laws of logic. In materialism, there is no reason to trust a theory, because I can always say, you believe what you believe because of your atoms, and I believe what I believe because my atoms make me believe what I believe. And if I want to change your beliefs or my beliefs, then let's go and see a neurosurgeon. But that's not the way how it works. We realize that we actually can trust our thinking. But materialism does not provide us good grounds on which we can actually believe that our thoughts are true. When I take a Christian worldview, then I have a good explanation. And this is really very nicely exemplified in the original beacon of the Harvard University. Like we have here a word that is called veritas, Latin for truth. And veritas is written across 3 books. One book represents the Bible, God's word. That is all the information that we need to be revealed by God himself because we could not come up with it ourselves. So that's one book for truth. There's another book about truth, and that's God's works, nature, doing research in nature. The Bible contains a few passages that relate to natural processes, but most of that is not contained in the Bible. So we need to find out ourselves. Quantum mechanics. You don't find quantum mechanics in the Bible. So you have to go there and study nature. And you find quantum mechanics, and it seems to work. It seems to be correlated to truth, to the true reality. And then the third book is God's thoughts, God's thinking, God's mind. And as we are created in the image of God, hence we can try to think his thoughts after him. Yeah, God is reasonable. He is the ultimate reason, and his thoughts are so much higher than our thoughts, as the heaven is above the earth, and the heaven is even much bigger in today's days than it was in the biblical times. So yes, we cannot understand everything, but as we are created in the likeness of God, we can at least think some thoughts of God after him. And that's why science works. We are created in his image, and his thoughts are contained in his creation, and so we can discover his thoughts in creation. And that's a good explanation why science works and why we can trust our mind, because it's not the product of chance and necessity, but because we were made in the image of God by someone who had a plan and an intention. So again, the Lama makes us think, what is more plausible, materialism or Christian theism, if we come to believe in scientific truths? But now let's dive into what has science actually discovered. What kinds of discoveries can we find? Well, the first discovery is the universe. And there's the question, why is there anything at all? Why is there not nothing? That's a very good question, but we cannot experiment on that. Well, usually people would say if we travel back 100 years in time, 1920s, Albert Einstein and the leading astrophysicists and cosmologists would say the universe has always been there. There has never been nothing. There has always been something, and that's the universe. And on a large scale, the universe will always be there and will not change on the large scale. Yes, there will be some changes on a minor little planet like Earth, but the universe does not care about that. The basic structure of the universe will always be the same. So the universe is eternal and static. However, then there came two intelligent people and they challenged Einstein. One was Catholic priest Georges Lemaitre from Belgium. The other one was a Russian physicist, Alexander Friedmann, who was also an Orthodox believer, as far as I've heard. And both of them had the idea you can solve Albert Einstein's relativistic equations of general relativity in a way that the universe is not static and eternal, but that it has a beginning. And this solution is even mathematically more stable than Einstein's own solution with a static eternal universe. And at the beginning, Einstein was very reluctant and said, no. Mathematically, you are right. You can solve my equations like that. But physically, this does not make sense. We know that the universe has been there forever. Where should it come from? There is nothing else. So the universe has been there forever. But then there was additional evidence by experimental physicists, by observers of the universe, Edwin Hubble, for example. And so evidence came to arise that the solution with the beginning is more accurate and can describe the data about the universe better than actually the static solution. And Sir Arthur Eddington said, philosophically, the notion of a beginning of the present order of nature is repugnant. Repugnant? I should like to find a genuine loophole. So it was not physics, it was philosophy, it was metaphysics worldview that told him, no, a beginning, that smells a bit strange to me. The universe must be eternal somehow, otherwise we have a theological problem. And that is something that even was discussed 50 years later by John Gribbin in Nature. The biggest problem with the Big Bang theory of the origin of the universe is philosophical, perhaps even theological. What was there before the Big Bang? This is a bad question because there was no time probably before the Big Bang, at least no time as we know it. But we can ask, what is the cause of the Big Bang? What is the reason, the cause of the Big Bang? What caused the Big Bang? If the Big Bang had a beginning, it must have a cause, as we will see. Arno Penzias, who earned the Nobel Prize for a very important discovery, the cosmic microwave background in the 60s, he had no problem with that. He's a Jewish believer, and he wrote, the best data we have concerning the Big Bang are exactly what I would have predicted had I nothing to go on but the 5 books of Moses, the Psalms, and the Bible as a whole. So he has no problem with it. The atheist has a big problem with the idea that the universe should have a beginning. And the reason is an argument that is already much older than these discoveries in the 20th century. It's the so-called Kalam cosmological argument, which you might know from William Lane Craig. And this has 2 premises. The first premise is everything that has a beginning has a cause, like this lecture. This lecture began some half an hour ago or something, and now we are there. But it was not always there. So what caused this lecture to begin? It was probably the opening speech of Dalibor. And then the lecture started. Inspiring speech, yes. And second, the universe is not eternal, but it has a beginning. If both premises are correct, then the universe must have a cause. It is not self-explaining, and that's a shock, because for a materialist, the universe must be self-explaining. Otherwise, materialism has a big hole in itself, in its very fabric, in its very essence, in its very beginnings. And that's a big problem, of course. So what cause would we need for a material universe? Well, we must need an uncaused cause. We must need an immaterial cause, which actually calls matter into being. We need an eternal cause without a beginning. Otherwise, we have an infinite chain of causes, which is always a big problem philosophically and scientifically. And it should be beyond space. and effective. And if we take an eternal person with a will, which is almighty, which is omnipresent, not bound to a certain place in space, then we come very close to the biblical God. This is not a proof that this is the best cause, but at least it shows it's a very good explanation, at least a better explanation for why the universe is there than to say, well, it just banged and the universe for some reason was there and we don't know why. This has more explanatory power, I would say. And so, that the universe has a beginning is something that fits very well with the Christian notion of creation. And now physicists love to experiment and to think crazy things. Like, why don't we create our own universe? So let's sit down and create our own universe, take a paper, take a pencil, and write down the equations, just change a few parameters, or enter it into the computer, or ask AI. And as soon as you change the basic parameters of the universe a little bit, we find out that we would not be there anymore. We observe that the ratios of the fundamental constants of the universe, which is the fundamental forces and the fundamental masses of the universe, of the elementary particles like the electron and the quarks, which make up the protons, the nuclei of the atom, so on. All these fundamental constants that we only can measure but not calculate, we cannot predict them by any theory, we can only measure them. These ratios are balanced to an astonishing accuracy. Just to give you one example, one important parameter in the Big Bang scenario is the so-called dark energy. It's the vacuum energy density, or the force that actually drives the universe apart, that extends the universe. So, and this dark energy must fit in relation to the gravitational force with an accuracy of 1 to 10 to the power of 60. So that is a 0, dot, and then there are 59 zeros, and then a 1. That's a very strong accuracy. If you think about what human beings can achieve in terms of accuracy, we are already quite proud when we achieve 1 to 10 to the power of 23. For example, in gravitation wave telescopes. But not every one of us has one of these at home, because they are very expensive and they need to be really adjusted well. There are just a few of them around the world. So, Lawrence Krauss, not a believer, wrote in the Astrophysical Journal, this is the most extreme fine-tuning problem that is known to us in physics. How can we somehow grasp that number, this very tiny number? Astrophysicist Paul Davies compares this ratio to a soldier trying to hit a 1-cent coin at the other end of the universe. So not in another city or on another continent, which might already be a challenge for most of us, not on another planet or another solar system, no, at the end of the visible to us visible universe. Then the surface of that 1-cent coin is exactly the 1 to 10 to the power of 60th part of the surface of the whole sphere around where we observe, around our central point, our center. Or another, maybe even easier example would be if we take one hair, I can't surf with a hair, unfortunately, but you might have some. If we take one hair and compare it to the total mass, to the estimated total mass of the universe, this is about the 10 to the 60th part of the total mass of the universe. So we can say with full justification, by one hair, we would not be here. This is amazing, isn't it? It's an amazing accuracy. And it's not just this one parameter, the vacuum energy density or the dark energy and the gravitational energy density at the beginning of the Big Bang, but there are many other parameters. And it's like cracking a vault. If you want to crack a vault, you need to adjust the numbers and stop at the right time, then adjust the next number, and all the numbers must fit. As soon as you get one number incorrectly, the vault will not open. And if the vault will not open, that would mean in the universe, no life, no stars, or even no atoms, or even no universe, and hence no complex carbon chemistry, hence no life as we know it. In our movie, Our Fascinating Universe, you will find many more of these examples, but that would take us too long now. So, even atheist philosophers have really pondered about this. A super intellect has monkeyed with physics as well as with chemistry and biology. And this is just the complete equipment of the universe, the universal fine-tuning. There is a second kind of fine-tuning, and that's our own place in this universe, our planet Earth. We are located with our solar system in a side arm of our galaxy, which is very important because this way we don't get all the hard radiation that would kill life at once when we would be in one of the main arms where a lot of supernova happen and a lot of neutron stars are present. But we are between main arms so that there are enough heavy elements like carbon, iron, oxygen, nitrogen, everything that we need for life, because they are produced in supernova explosions, as far as physics tells us in the astrophysical picture of the world. And so we have the right place in the galaxy. The sun has the right spectrum so that photosynthesis is possible, and the right radiation energy, not too strong and not too weak, so that we can live with enough energy, but we are not destroyed by it. And Earth has the right distance. We live in the habitable zone, just the right distance to sun, so that water can be liquid and doesn't freeze, like on Mars, and does not boil, like on Venus. We have liquid water. The magnetic field shields us from the sun's solar wind, which is very dangerous for life, because it's charged particles, they would destroy us at once. So a lot of these things come together. This is taken from Reasons to Believe, from reasons.org, from Hugh Ross. They have identified 100 parameters that need to fit so that we can actually exist. And so we can conclude the so-called anthropic principle. We are here, no doubt, otherwise we could not be at this lecture. And why are we here? Well, because the universe has exactly the properties that it must have so that we can be here. Because otherwise, we can't be here. Is that an explanation? No. It's just a logical syllogism. Because logically, of course, it is correct. If I observe that we are here, the universe must have the properties that allow for our existence. Everything else would not make sense. But physically, scientifically, our existence is not the cause and not the reason for the universe to have the properties it has. Because the universe was here before we were here. So this does not explain actually the fine-tuning, this so-called anthropic principle, and even atheists dispute it and say, well, actually, this is not a good explanation. It's just the summary of an observation, but it's not an explanation because it does not give us a real cause. So we can construct a teleological argument from that. If, first, many independent factors are fine-tuned to an astonishing degree, as we see in the so-called anthropic principle, then this indicates the notion of a purpose. The purpose that something should be achieved that can only be achieved at a certain interaction of these factors or a certain combination of these factors. But if we observe a notion, or if we observe the notion of a purpose, then this implies the existence of an intentional mind. Because a purpose can only exist if there is someone who can have purposes, an intentional being, a person with a mind, rationality, and intentionality with a will, with a free will. And again, this indicates if we agree that the fine-tuning is best explained by purpose, then this is a good argument for the existence of a personal, purposeful being, God, who is very powerful at least, if not even almighty, and who has good intentions about life, who wants life to be there. Of course, you can dispute whether this is a purpose or not, and some people dispute it, that life is not a purpose. But on the other hand, in all other versions of the universe, there would not be life. But we live exactly in a version which allows for life, even though it's a very tiny point in the realm of possibilities. Arno Penzias again comments on that. Astronomy leads us to a unique event, a universe which was created out of nothing. One with the very delicate balance needed to provide exactly the conditions to permit life. One which has an underlying, one might even say, supernatural plan. Again, the plan can only be supernatural because matter has no plans. And human beings were not there and aliens were not there because when the universe was not there, there could only be a supernatural being with a plan. What is the atheistic or materialistic alternative? The alternative is always to say, we are not the only universe. You know, when you play the lottery just once, you will probably not win the jackpot with 6 correct numbers plus the special super number. But if a lot of people play the lottery every weekend, again and again, it will happen after a few months or after 1 year that someone will actually crack the jackpot. And so some astrophysicists say, because our universe is so special, this is a good argument that there must be other universes. But is that a conclusive argument? At least not a scientific argument, because these other universes are not observable. They are not part of our universe. They don't really interact with our universe. They are only postulated in order to explain why our universe is so special. And they try to get away with the large accuracy and with the large improbability of that accuracy. And then, if you assume that there are many, many universes, you need to ask the question, where do they come from? And when you think about mechanisms that produce universes, usually the mechanisms that we know would produce any kind of universes, but not ours, because it's so special. Hence, the mechanism that produces universes must again be fine-tuned if you believe in many universes in a multiverse. So what we have achieved is we have moved the fine-tuning from the first floor to the ground floor, from our universe and the parameters of our universe in the first floor to the mechanism that produces universes in the ground floor. Even though we don't even know what this mechanism is and whether there are other universes, but even in that way, how they want to avoid the creation hypothesis, they don't get rid of the fine-tuning. The fine-tuning will always be around, either in our universe or in the mechanism that creates other universes. So we don't get rid of that. And John Polkinghorne, a British astrophysicist or physicist actually in quantum theory and later became an Anglican priest, he wrote a book about this just when this whole multiverse theory came up in the 80s. And the reason why it came up was exactly the fine-tuning of the universe. That was the reason why people started to believe there must be more than one universe. And he says, let us recognize these speculations for what they are. They are not physics, but in the strictest sense, metaphysics. There is no purely scientific reason to believe in an ensemble of universes. By construction, these other worlds are unknowable by us. A possible explanation of equal intellectual respectability and, to my mind, greater economy and elegance, which is important for a scientific theory, to be economic and to be elegant. A possible explanation of equal intellectual respectability would be that this one world is the way it is because it is the creation of the will of a creator who purposes that it should be so. So on scientific grounds, you cannot say that the creation hypothesis is in any way worse or weaker than the materialistic hypothesis that everything pops into existence just by chance and necessity. That's what he basically says. It really can be best explained, I would say, by a purpose, if all these parameters fit in the best possible way. So again, our Lama should make us think a little bit about this. I've now talked a lot about life. What is life? Well, earlier people thought life is just like matter. If you cut it short and smaller and smaller and smaller, you will end up with very simple, tiny balls, atoms. But in life it was different. It was not simple atoms that are the basis of life, but it was cells. And cells, even though they look simple from the outside, are by no means simple. Like in this very simplified sketch, you already discover several dozens of different molecules, very complicated molecules. Molecules that consist of thousands or 10,000s of so-called amino acids. Amino acids are like the Lego stones, the building blocks of these macromolecules. And then you can ask as a chemist, what do I have to do? Which liquids do I have to mix in order to get exactly this kind of molecule? Like, for example, a centriole or a mitochondrion or a lysosome or whatever. All these molecules that fulfill certain functions in the cell. Some produce energy, others do the digestion, others do transport, and so on. And the answer is, it's not enough to just mix something, because these molecules are actually built. They are built on the basis of information. This is what actually Watson and Crick discovered in 1953, that there is a molecule that is not itself a protein, but it's a deoxyribonucleic acid, so a completely different chemical substance. But this substance actually contains a code, and the code is here in those base pairs that are orthogonal to the spiral of the DNA. And the order would, on chemical grounds, be arbitrary. You could combine these bases in any way along this ladder. But always three of these, and you usually use these letters, A, C, T, G, to denote these different building blocks, always three of them code for an amino acid. And another very complex molecule actually attaches to the DNA strand, reads it step by step, always three letters, and then according to this code, like if we have here ACG, then we have ACG, and we end up with threonine. Threonine is a certain amino acid, one of 20 amino acids that are coded that way. And so the next building block with ACG would be a threonine. And that would be attached to the existing strand of amino acids, and so on. And only in this way, these molecules are built. We don't find these protein molecules anywhere in the universe. Nowhere. Only on planet Earth, and only within living cells, or cells that have just died from living beings. Because they are only produced in this system, not by any other chemical mechanism that we know. If we travel to planet Mars and we find a machine that reproduces itself and builds new machines all the time, decoding a certain code, an algorithmic code, what would we think? We would say, caution, on this planet could be intelligent life, intelligent beings that are really able to construct such a machine. If we now travel back from Mars to Earth and discover that bacteria, plants, mushrooms, animals, human beings, all the living beings on this planet work on coded information, what should we conclude? Always when we encounter algorithmic coded information, human beings have more than 3 billion letters of coded information in our genome, always then we suppose there is an intelligent sender. We conclude there is an intelligent sender. Should life be the only exception to this general rule that we work with in informatics all the time? Who has the burden of proof? Is the burden of proof on the side of the materialist or on the side of the theist? The materialist would say, well, there is no God, hence you have to prove that there is God, and information must come about by purely natural processes. as a theist, I would say, well, if we look in science and we have lots of examples of information, then what we know from science is information is always produced by intelligent beings, intelligent senders. So the burden of proof is on you to show that there is a natural mechanism that can actually produce information. Even though information itself is not material, but it's immaterial, which is very important. Information can be carried by material media, but information itself is immaterial. You can represent information on different material carriers, like on a sheet of paper, on a screen, on DNA, on silicon, in your computer, and so on. It's always the same information, maybe, but it's different material carriers, which shows information is not identical with its carrier. Okay, something more to think about with the Llama of Wisdom. And I think at this point, because we have gone already quite long, I will skip the next question, why is life so purposeful and why is there consciousness? If you are interested, you can ask the question later and I can tell you about it. I want to jump to the final point, that is drawing the conclusion. What do we make of these observations? I find it very interesting to read stories of people who changed their mind, no matter in which direction, and to ask why did they change their mind. And there was a very famous British philosopher, an atheist, Anthony Flew, who loved to discuss Christian philosophers to prove that there is no God. And he wrote a book in 2005 entitled, with the title, There is a God. There is no God, no is crossed out, and A is written above it. So there is a God. And he writes on page 88, I now believe, after he explained why he had been an atheist before, I now believe that the universe was brought into existence by an infinite intelligence. Why? This is the world picture as I see it that has emerged from modern science. First, the fact that nature obeys laws. We've talked about that. Second, the dimension of life, of intelligently organized and purpose-driven beings. Information, for example, as one of the fundamental ingredients of living systems. And third, the very existence of nature. Why is there anything and not nothing? Why has the universe a beginning? And what is the best explanation for that beginning? And he says we must follow the argument wherever it leads. And for him, that leads to the existence of an infinite intelligence. He came to that conclusion not because of reading the Bible, but because of studying scientific evidence, interestingly. That doesn't make him a Christian, of course, but at least it shows that materialism, in his view, is less plausible than faith in a personal God. Going back to Jacques Monod, that was our starting point. We are alone in a meaningless universe without justice and without purpose, without comfort, without hope. That's one story. But I hope we could see that this does not have to be the end, that we are lost. But if there is a God who took so much effort to create such a great universe, with so much fine-tuning, with such a complex system like life, living systems, shouldn't he have taken every effort to communicate with that life if he has created us as communicative human beings? And I believe he did communicate in the Bible and in Jesus Christ. And if that is true, then this God has a message for us. For example, in Jeremiah, God says, I have loved you with an everlasting love. I've drawn you with unfailing kindness. This is, of course, said in the Old Testament to the people of Israel, but we know from Jesus Christ that all the promises that were made to Israel actually are valid for all humanity. God speaks that to every one of us. So it's also true for yourself. And when you look in the sky and see the stars and the fine-tuned universe and the miracle of your own existence, you can always think, he has loved me with an everlasting love. And he draws me with unfailing kindness to himself. We are created with a purpose, not by accident. Our life has meaning, like in a jigsaw puzzle. You know, in a jigsaw puzzle, you have unique puzzle pieces. Every piece is unique, whether it's big or small, doesn't matter. It's unique, But no puzzle piece contains the whole meaning of the jigsaw puzzle. Only the creator of the whole jigsaw puzzle knows the meaning of the whole jigsaw puzzle. But every single unique piece is necessary to have the whole picture. And so God has a plan for you in this universe, in your life. And when I discovered that, I thought, I want to be part of that plan. God built something really big and fascinating with us in this world. And there are still a lot of empty spaces, people who can join. And it will not be that uncomfortable like this wall here, by the way, I would say, but it's a great plan. And so my invitation to you is join that building, join the jigsaw puzzle, and connect to God. Pray to God, read His Word, study God, study yourself, and start to believe that there is a God who loves you. Thank you very much for listening.